This is Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
On the show, you'll hear real conversations about what matters most to the people behind the scenes who are shaping Australian construction.
From lawyers and contract administrators to engineers, commercial managers, consultants, and all the other experts forging the future of Australian infrastructure today. I'm Mawarna Matanda.
I'm BJ Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. This episode is part one of a special 3-part series exploring culture in the construction industry, including mental health, diversity, leadership, and the future of workforce sustainability across the sector. Today we're chatting with Gabrielle Trainor. Gabrielle is a distinguished non-executive director, advisor, and thought leader whose career spans more than 25 years across public and private sector boards. Her experience touches a remarkable breadth of industries, from infrastructure, transport, and financial services to arts, culture, and urban development. Today, we are discussing her work as chair of the Construction Industry Culture Taskforce, or CICT. We discuss the culture standard that was piloted across projects in New South Wales and Victoria, the outcomes of those programs, and the next steps for the CICT. Let's jump in. Gabrielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great to be with you.
It's lovely to have you here this morning. Gabrielle, your career a lot of people would be aware of because you're so prevalent in the community. But I'd like to start by asking you, for those listeners who are not familiar with you, how did you get into the construction industry?
Very good question, Jennifer, and probably more serendipitous than anything. I started out in Melbourne as I did a law degree and was a lawyer for a little while, but really did my law degree more as a background to what I really wanted to do at the time, which was to be a journalist. So I was really fortunate to work as a journalist for the Melbourne Herald when it was a very big newspaper, selling 600,000 copies a day, and absolutely loved that environment. And I think it built on the skills that you try and develop in a legal environment with the powers of, quick analysis and quick thinking and hopefully a bit of clarity in the way that you regard issues and telling stories. So I did that for quite a while and then moved to Sydney and worked with Elizabeth Evatt at the Family Court, and then worked in government in Canberra in the Attorney General's Department for quite a while, and then began my sort of next career as a consultant in public policy and issues management and those kind of things. And I guess in the early 90s, I got my first opportunity to become a director of a state-owned enterprise that was in New South Wales, and then really was very lucky to have a sort of parallel career to the consultancy work as an NED. And this was, way back in the 90s, as I said, when anyone who wore a frock was sought after to join boards, because obviously the push for equity and inclusion was really just beginning in those days, and people were saying, no, we do need women on boards. Well, of course, they had been underrepresented. And so I was able then to get the opportunity, very privileged, to sit on a number of boards, and I seemed somehow to specialise in government boards and then other boards to do with urban development and construction and infrastructure. And so I've been really fortunate to sit on boards such as the Barangaroo Delivery Authority, way back in Melbourne, the Docklands Authority, Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority, and I've only fairly recently retired as chair of Infrastructure Australia, and I now sit on the board of a construction company, Built, which is quite a big national firm doing some great work. So I suppose it's one of those things that you get an opportunity in a sector and then, the opportunities that just seem to roll on from there, and you develop sort of a quasi-specialisation. Having said that, I've been really lucky to sit on a whole range of different kinds of boards, from the arts to sport. I sit on the AFL Commission, for instance. So I'm really lucky to have a terrific blend of interesting things and environments where you can learn and apply your learnings to the next challenge in the boardroom. So that's really how it evolved.
Incredible. It sounds like you've had not just one career, but absolutely many different careers as you've gone along. So that's fantastic. I want to ask you, we're going to get in today to your work at the Culture in Construction Taskforce and talk about some of the issues in our industry. But before we get into the issues, what I want to ask you is, what do you love about the construction industry?
The construction industry is absolutely miraculous in so many ways, isn't it? These incredible feats of engineering and imagination that give us all quality of life, whether it is water projects, energy projects, particularly transport projects. I'm very lucky to live in Crow's Nest in New South Wales, and we've got a beautiful sparkling metro just practically at the door here. And these projects are absolutely, transformational for communities. And the brilliance and commitment of the people who work in the construction industry. It's an industry that people really do get a great deal of satisfaction out of. There's no doubt about that. And the expertise and passion people have for it is quite extraordinary. But, at the same time, it can be a very, very tough and unforgiving environment for a lot of people who work in construction. But when you see the results, you can't help but really marvel and be in awe of the many thousands of great people who are part of the industry.
Yes, I really love that, what you said there about the ability for the industry to really transform our communities, because it's something that I don't think that we stop and appreciate when we are talking about the construction industry, that really it has that powerful transformative aspect of really making our lives a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you really see it with transport projects writ large, but, a lot of the unseen things in energy and water particularly, and clearly that's a major national priority next to housing, of course. So, all the people who work in the industry are contributors, whether they really kind of think about that much or not, to the quality of life and the prosperity of Australia.
Absolutely. Now, tell us a little bit about the history or the background to the Culture in Construction Taskforce. How did it come to be?
Very good question. And we've got to go back to about 2018 for the genesis of the Construction Industry Culture Taskforce. At that time, the New South Wales government and the Victorian government were in very active discussions with the Australian Constructors Association, and they formed a forum called the SILF, the Construction Industry Leadership Forum. And they were addressing three baskets of issues, I guess, that they were all concerned about: the delivery agencies on the government side and also, of course, the construction firms themselves. And the first basket of issues, though they're all highly interrelated, was to do with the commerciality of contracting for government, risk allocation, the cost of bidding and complexity, those kind of things. So they were really trying to improve the settings there and set up this forum to address those. But they also recognised that one of the other big issues facing the industry with this avalanche of work that we're all familiar with, those tsunami charts, was the capacity and capability of the people. There were major hundreds of thousands of jobs shortfalls when you looked at the pipeline of work for all these, particularly transport projects at the time, that were on the slate for governments and in fact had been approved. So that was a major concern and certainly one of the big topics that the SILF was trying to address. And then the third interrelated issue was the culture of the industry, which was seen to be in some ways the product of the other two factors. And it was seen to be adversarial, it was seen to be a very difficult environment for people to work in. The mental health statistics, well, they're still absolutely appalling. Not necessarily causation, but certainly very, very strong and undeniable correlation. And of course, construction was really missing out on half the workforce because only 2% of women were attracted to trades in the construction industry, and it was about 12% at the time of women in the industry at large. So with these acute problems, these three interrelated problems, the SILF decided to spin off the culture considerations to a separate task force. And so I was asked to get involved with that back in the end of 2018 with a whole group of terrific people across the industry, both from the two governments, New South Wales and Victoria, delivery agencies mainly, and representatives from various firms, large and small, as well as other figures in the construction industry who had something to contribute. It was quite a unique setup, really, because we weren't part of a departmental task force. We weren't responding to a minister. It was very much a sort of collective effort. And so we set that up. Then as time went on, we brought in interaction with the union movement, which of course was very important as well. So the idea was that in order to try and address the cultural issues, that the government agencies, and it was particularly Jim Betts and Tim Reardon. Jim Betts now the head of the Infrastructure Department in Canberra, and Tim Reardon, who now, though at the time was Premiers in New South Wales, is now the Chief Commissioner of Infrastructure Australia. Those guys and quite a number of other really passionate people in the bureaucracy decided that procurement was a way that you could collaborate to improve the settings of the industry. You could collaborate with the construction firms and come up with a standard that you could use in procurement, to use that lever to really try and make a step change in those cultural elements of the settings of the industry. And so we set about thinking what a standard to try and improve mental health and wellbeing and diversity might look like. And we knew that if we were to introduce a standard, that it would have to have a strong evidence base to actually stand the scrutiny, but stand the test of practicality and outcomes that we wanted. So very early in the piece, we involved a team of leading academics, including distinguished Professor Helen Lingard from RMIT, who's probably known to a lot of the listeners and is probably the preeminent Australian, and in fact she's got an international reputation for work on construction industry. So we asked Helen to form a team of academics, and she led it. And they worked with us initially to do a desktop study of what might be included in a standard to actually move the needle based on research that had been done. And so it was not only looking at what you might do to address diversity and make the workplace better for women particularly, but everybody, not only to address the mental health and wellbeing settings, but the research certainly showed that you could do plenty of things in those other two domains, the diversity and wellbeing domains, but unless you actually addressed the working hours of people in the industry, not only the extent of the hours that they worked, but also to try and address flexibility in a meaningful way, that you would never be able to really get the step change that the industry needed. And so that was the thesis that the culture standard was built around, that you needed to address those three domains in an integrated way, and that was based on research. But the second thing we did was to try and quantify doing nothing, and we came up with a study that suggested that if the industry could change those settings, they would save Australia $8 billion a year minimum, and would do things like open up opportunities for women who are partners of people who work in the industry, who are working, 70, 80 hours, not uncommon, and working Saturdays, very prevalent. You could open economic opportunities up to the partners of people in the industry. If you had a standard in the industry where the men, typically men, were able to assume some of the caring roles for their families and work sensible hours and have the other benefits of better wellbeing, better mental health, and just a better, more respectful workplace. So that $8 billion was there to be saved, and we had the bones of a standard based on that initial research. So the next step, and a very important step that took some time, and of course COVID happened in the middle of all of this, the next step was to pilot a standard. And so the way we did that was to select 5 projects, 3 in New South Wales and 2 in Victoria, were different kinds of projects. We knew that we couldn't have nice friendly alliances, totally focused on testing the standard, and we couldn't only have transport projects. We wanted to get a variety of pilots to really try and test, stress test the standard as best as possible. So we did pilot the standard across those 5 projects, 2 roads projects, a school, a hospital and a level crossing across those 2 states. And It was very extensive research that we did, and we were particularly keen to look at productivity. There were a lot of sceptics, of course, saying, well, if you're going to implement a standard that requires fewer working hours, and in fact our standard suggested no individual on a project should work more than 50 hours a week average, and within that 50 hours should have flexibility, and those 50 hours should be done on a 5 in 7 regime wherever possible on Monday to Friday. But of course we know many projects can't be achieved Monday to Friday. Sites can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still comply with the culture standard that is very people-centric. It looks at the individual. And around that, in an integrated way, there were standards to do with diversity and health and wellbeing. And for people who are interested in looking at the standards in more detail, cultureandconstruction.com.au has all the information that you might like to see the elements of the standard, but importantly to see how they were applied and what the results of the pilots were.
Yeah, well, speaking of the results, are you able to just give us a bit of a summary of what those results were and whether there was anything about them that surprised you?
Well, there was a lot of scepticism about the application of the culture standard to projects. Of course, people thought it's going to cost more, it's going to take longer, and, you know, the industry was under such pressure. It seemed really counterintuitive to say, really, to make the step change, you actually have to focus in on people and their working hours, and in many cases reduce the working hours from the ridiculous hours that people are doing, and you've got to introduce more flexibility. So that seemed counterintuitive to people. They were really sceptical about the impact on time and cost, and we were very, very pleased that all the research, which was done over a couple of years on these 5 different projects, demonstrated no discernible impact on time or cost for the project. So that was a very, very big tick. In terms of a productivity dividend, we found that attrition rates on the projects went down remarkably and quantifiably, which I think extrapolated across Australia, though we focused on the 2 states, New South Wales and Victoria, were savings of about $1 billion a year in attrition alone. So that was a very significant finding. The qualitative work that was done showed that overwhelmingly people supported working under the culture standard. There was huge support among both salaried and waged workers for the standard, and particularly the projects that could work Monday to Friday. People just absolutely loved getting their weekends back. There was a bit of scepticism about how people would respond to having fewer working hours, and indeed at the beginning, you know, some people were saying, no, I just need the hours. I need the hours. I've got mortgages and I want to buy Hilux, and we could understand all of that. But for a great proportion of those people who at the beginning were saying, I don't know about this, by the end of the study, they turned around and said the small impact, and it was a very small impact on our pocket, which was supported by the unions, by the way, was well worth it. It really offset any financial concerns that I have time with my family, to take my kids to Auskick on a Saturday morning, to feel better, to feel more refreshed, to have 2 days off a week, hopefully sequentially, to really, you know, restore and refresh. And I felt more productive. I was more productive. And on the sites that were able to work Monday to Friday, I mean, Saturday, the reputation for work on Saturdays is, of course, that it's notoriously unproductive, that really it's just a bit of a buffer day and the sausage sizzle starts pretty early. But where Saturdays were not worked on these projects, the result was that process improvements were made. Because they couldn't just spill over to Saturday, people found smarter and cleverer ways of automating things or doing things differently and better during the weekdays.
Yeah.
More efficiently. So there was a productivity dividend payable there as well. Women felt much more respected and were much more attracted to sites that worked under the culture standard, and the wellbeing statistics, of course, were very compelling as well. And we did about 1,000 interactions with people on the sites, you know, many, many focus groups as well as surveys. And, you know, it was a very, very thorough piece of work that you can access on the site. So we were not really surprised, but we were very, very delighted to see our thesis proven, to see that the productivity dividend was there, to see that the mythology around, oh, this is just secret women's business because clearly it benefited everybody, or the mythology around this is going to be expensive or this is going to take more time. None of those things were proven, and in fact it did show, and we'd like to do more longitudinal study obviously, it did show that people found the sites under the culture standard much better to work on, therefore they were happier to stay. You know, attrition rates in the industry are very, very high, so that was a particularly encouraging piece of data that we got, that people really preferred working under the standard.
That's fantastic. So you mentioned the issue of women on construction sites. I'd like to ask you further about that, because there's been a lot of talk about the issue of gender diversity and inclusion in the construction industry and how it's really been lacking. Why do you think that the construction industry doesn't attract more gender diversity? You mentioned the long working hours, which is what the pilot programs were trying to reduce. But are there other factors involved there?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and it does involve the intersection of all those things we're trying to address. Certainly, it's not only the long working hours, it's the inflexibility of the working hours that are difficult for, well, everybody, particularly young men now too. They want to be able to pick up their kids from childcare, or, you know, have a Saturday with the family, or even walk their dog, go to the gym, see their mum. And one of the pilots particularly focused on flexibility, as everybody had a flexibility plan. And, you know, those kind of things are really important to people, to not get the walk of shame as you have to leave to pick up your kids, or as you come in late for the toolbox talk in the morning because you've dropped the kids off. That stigma completely was dispelled in the pilots because the focus was on people and people centricity. So that was really, you know, in many ways the driver. But if at the same time, I mean, I think one of the other reasons that women aren't attracted to the industry is because, you know, it is a sort of interlocking of all these issues. If you've got ridiculous working hours, naturally it's men who are physically more attractive to the industry historically. And that whole testosterone culture can be really, really difficult for women. And we know that, you know, the history of the construction industry has been that there's a lot of banter on sites and a lot of just disrespectful conduct. And with a different approach that the culture standard brought, really focusing in on people, there's no doubt that women found the environment more respectful. Banter still happened, as our study showed, but they felt that they could report it quite happily and they knew something would be done about it when it happened. So that was, you know, they're really important messages. But I think, you know, the construction industry is becoming much more sophisticated, particularly at Tier 1 and Tier 2 level. Digitisation is quite transformational. Modern methods, all these things are going to open up many more opportunities for women. And I think even AI, people are beginning to think about the value of work that can't be replaced by AI. And certainly the construction industry is one of those industries where there's always going to be plenty of opportunity for people to do meaningful, really interesting jobs that require human intelligence as well as technology. So, you know, I feel optimistic if we can change the settings that we will get. And the beauty of procurement, of course, is that if the delivery agencies are requiring the culture standard in procurement, it flows down through the supply chain. And that's where it is difficult for the smaller businesses who don't have HR departments. We know that many smaller construction firms are really just fighting for survival at the moment and they can't keep up with the work. So to actually get the bandwidth and the headspace to be able to think about these issues is very hard. But if you're part of a supply chain in a project that works under the culture standard, you are supported by the head contractor in compliance because you're accountable. The head contractor is accountable under the contract. So that's where change we can see is really beginning to happen. I mean, if the industry had been able to do this years ago, as many industries have, they would have. But it's been an industry under such pressure for so long that it's been just not able to be achieved to the extent that it really needs. And that's where the spiral the downward spiral of the unattractiveness of the industry has created more pressure. So it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
we can see now there's a way to break it,
There's light.
to help break it anyway.
Yes. So what are the next steps then for the CICT now that you've had the pilot programs and you've released the final report? What's next?
Well, the task force has really finished, what it set out to do by demonstrating that this standard works and can work to improve the industry. It's not a silver bullet, there'll always be more to do. But we're seeing that it now has some very good momentum across the jurisdictions. Projects in the ACT, for instance, are all now being done under the Culture Standard. Development Victoria is doing some projects under the Culture Standard. The Federation funding agreements on land transport are requiring state agencies that want federal funding for projects to address culture in their procurement. Western Australia just put a line in its most recent budget to put some funds toward some pilot projects in the West for the Culture Standard. So we can see the ripple effect is beginning to really get some steam, which we're really happy about.
And what has been the wider industry reaction? Have you continued to get any further pushback?
But there will always be some people who are sceptical about these things, despite what is very compelling evidence. It's just the way we've always done things, and we can't think about that now. And in fact, someone was telling me the other day that at one of the industry associations, someone said, oh, well, thank God the pedal is not being pushed so hard on diversity and inclusion now, and we can kind of forget about the Culture Standard, which is pretty extraordinary. But anyway, that was a story I was told. So there will always be pockets of resistance where people say, well, it was all fine on the pilot projects where they knew that they were being examined by the researchers and everyone went the extra mile. But we've found some fantastic advocates in industry for the Culture Standard. There's no doubt about that. People like Dean Rare from Fulton Hogan, he applies the Culture Standard whether delivery agencies require it or not to Fulton Hogan projects, and he's a wonderful advocate for it, but he's one of many. People who've actually lived it have seen the huge benefits for it. So, we rely on those advocates, and Infrastructure Australia now has a role in post-project evaluations that are Commonwealth funded to collect data on projects that are done under the Culture Standard. So there will be a longitudinal look at the effects of projects that are done under the Culture Standard. And it will require revision from time to time, of course. It'll require evaluation and review. So the ACA will stay involved with it, and certainly the many advocates in the public sector delivery agencies who, Health Infrastructure New South Wales is a great example. They've been doing Monday to Friday projects for many years and 5-day and 6-day programs that have no discernible difference in their time and cost outcomes. So there are many, many people out there who are barracking hard for adoption of the Culture Standard very, very broadly, and it is happening.
So what advice would you give to industry leaders wanting to change culture in the industry when they come up against the kind of pushback that you've mentioned of people in the industry saying, oh, well, we don't need to worry about diversity inclusion, we don't need to worry about culture anymore?
I think you just look at the evidence, the really compelling evidence that the Culture Taskforce has been able to deliver. But you also, you've got to stop and think about the acute skill shortages that we're still experiencing, and we just can't go on. It's the definition of insanity, isn't it? Going on doing the same again and again and finding the same negative result. I think we need 51,000, just women, we need 51,000 more women to work in housing to try and achieve the housing targets. You're not going to be able to do that by keeping the settings of the industry the way they are and making it an unattractive environment for women, but, for people generally. I think the Building Commission of New South Wales did a study, last year. It might have even been early this year. Anyway, a recent study saying that 63% of people in the industry were thinking of leaving. It is one of those industries that you've really got to focus on people. And one of the advocates that we've found who works much more in the skills and capability realm, and that's Professor Barney Glover, who's the Jobs and Skills Commissioner for the Commonwealth. He is a great advocate for the work we've done, applying it across his thoughts on industry, saying, well, you can have the best training packages in the world and you can do a lot with the TAFE system, But unless the settings of your industry are attractive to people, unless you actually pay attention to culture, whether it is construction, whether it's retail, whether it's hospitality, whether it's hairdressing, and his outfit covers all industries, financial services, digital services, unless you actually pay attention to the experience that people have in your industry, you're battling uphill. You've got to fix those settings first.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there's also the issue of an aging workforce and not having enough young people deciding to get into the industry as well and coming through and taking up that mantle as well, which, again, as you mentioned, is going to lead to labour shortages and us not meeting these targets.
Exactly. And, skill shortages means more expense. It's a simple equation. It has been important, though, to get this standard required because, great organisations like NAWIC and Mates in Construction and Inco, there have been plenty of people working on diversity for a long time. Governments have set targets. Various jurisdictions have put in place regimes to try and improve diversity, and there's been a lot of work done on mental health in the industry, been terrific. But I think we've now tried to demonstrate that unless you can actually address the working hours and the wellbeing and diversity in one integrated way, you're actually not going to move the needle to the extent that it needs to be moved.
So for listeners who want to get more involved, want to learn more, want to support the work of the CICT, what can they do?
They can go onto the website and learn as much as they can about the results of the pilots and the work that this task force has done. They're very welcome to get in touch with me, and through your podcast, I'm sure, Jennifer, you could find a way to direct people to speak to me if they're interested in doing it. But I think the most important thing is if people are convinced, and I think they should be, that there's a productivity benefit, there's a people benefit, there's a social benefit in thinking about culture as part of procurement, if they can implement it and advocate for it. And, the more people who get involved in this and see the benefits, the better. And it can be a life-changing experience for so many people in one of our biggest industries if we do it right. But, when I look back on a lot of the things I've been involved with, I've been really lucky. But this, you just know this can be a force for good, and it probably is one of the most satisfying things that I have ever been involved with, particularly when you think about the mental health of people in the industry. You're 6 times more likely to die of suicide. That statistic still, sends a shiver down my spine. 6 times more likely to die of suicide if you're a construction worker than to die in a workplace accident. I mean, if the application of the culture standard can alleviate that statistic alone and really change people's lives for the better, what a great thing to have been a small part of.
Well, on that note, Gabrielle, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Jennifer. I've really enjoyed our chat. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
The Society of Construction Law Australia is a national organisation of members at all stages of their professional career with a shared interest in construction law.
For more info about the Society of Construction Law Australia, head to the website scl.org.au. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Sound Cartel.
To make sure you don't miss an episode of Building Tomorrow, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app.
And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Moana Matanda.
I'm Bijay Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. And we'll see you in the next episode of Building Tomorrow.